and I'd like to welcome you tonight to a really very special event. Iran's foreign policy under new leadership is a really topical place for us to go, as Iran starts to struggle with what's happened with the current state of their international affairs. To discuss this tonight, we have Professor Shahram Akbar-Sadeh. He's a convener of the Middle East Studies Forum and Research, and he's a research professor in Middle East and Central Asian politics at Deakin University. He's the Deputy Director International of the Alfred Deakin Institute for Citizenship and Globalization. He's held the prestigious ARC Future Fellowship from 2013 to 2016 on the role of Islam in Iran's foreign policy making, and recently completed a Qatar Foundation grant on sectarianism in the Middle East. Professor Akbar-Sadeh has an extensive publication record and has contributed to public debate, including already at the Australian Institute of International Affairs. And we welcome him tonight to talk about Iran's foreign policy under new leadership. Professor, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you so much, James, for your very kind introduction, and thanks to the Australian Institute for International Affairs for inviting me to share my thoughts with you. I'm going to share my PowerPoint just to go through some of the key points that really stand out for the new president in Iran. As you will know, Ebhram Raisi was elected president in June this year, and this was quite an interesting election in Iran. Only 48%, nearly 49% of the population actually participated in the election. And that is quite a low historically in Iranian elections, because the leadership in Iran has been really pushing and encouraging everyone to participate in elections. The leadership sees elections as a vote of confidence in the regime as a whole. It's not just about choosing a candidate that is from the right or left of the spectrum. It's about expressing confidence in the regime as a whole. And the supreme leader in Iran, Ayatollah Khamenei, has made that very clear. But despite that, the turnout was only 49%. So this is quite a remarkable incident and experience for us to take note of. And I'm sure the leadership in Iran is also taking note of it. Raisi himself is a conservative. He's very close to the supreme leader, as I will go through in a second. He had served as Chief Justice of Iran, and he has always been in the judiciary process throughout his career. That makes him a very close confidant of the supreme leader, and you might even call him, you might even look at the Chief Justice and the supreme leader as representing a closed loop in the Iranian political system, because just as the supreme leader is not elected by the public, Chief Justice is also not elected by the public. In fact, the supreme leader appoints Chief Justice, and both of them appoint jointly the Guardian Council. And the Guardian Council's role is to vet candidates who stand for election. So the Guardian Council vetted candidates for the presidential election and approved the Chief Justice, Raisi, to stand. Raisi himself had appointed the Guardian Council. So it becomes a closed loop, really. You appoint the council recommends you to stand for election, and you're elected. So it does really make a mockery of any claim to democracy and popular representation in the Iranian system of government. Having said that, we're not here to talk about the Iranian system of government. We're here to talk about Raisi's vision and future direction in Iranian foreign policy, especially the nuclear deal. Just a quick footnote before I proceed, though. Raisi, because of his experience and his role in the judiciary, is now under sanctions by the United States, because when he was in Tehran as deputy judge of Tehran, Iran was engaged in extrajudicial killing of a lot of prisoners, political prisoners in Iran. And this was right at the end of the Iran-Iraq war. Amnesty International has noted, has claimed that Raisi was personally involved in those extrajudicial killings because he was deputy prosecutor in Tehran at the time. The United States has approved, has given credit to Amnesty International reports and really put him under sanctions. Now, that's going to present challenges for Raisi in office. How is he going to represent Iran internationally? Is he allowed to travel internationally? What happens if he travels to Europe? Would there be Interpol after him in European capitals? So a lot of question marks hanging over how he is going to manage international relations, visits. The most topical, of course, is the nuclear deal. And the interesting thing about the nuclear deal is that when the Rouhani administration signed the nuclear deal in 2015, Raisi was very critical. In fact, all the conservatives in the Iranian political system were very critical of the nuclear deal. They saw it as giving in, as surrendering Iran's sovereignty to the United States. They saw it as a sign of weakness against US pressure and US bullying. So he has been very critical. It's only in the last couple of months during the campaign for the presidential election that he changed his tune. That Raisi said, okay, if I'm elected, I will abide by the agreements. I will abide by any deal that is signed. But as it happens, no deal is signed yet. That is, it was signed in 2015. President Donald Trump withdrew from the deal. The deal was basically falling apart. Europeans tried to revive it, but to no avail. And now there is attempts. There have been serious push by the Biden administration to revive the deal, for the US to come back to the agreement after it withdrew from the deal. There have been talks in Vienna for the past few months, but the United States has not re-entered the deal. As a result, you might say there is no nuclear deal, because without the United States agreement and being part of the nuclear deal, there is no deal. A lot of sanctions continue to be imposed on Iran. And not just sanctions on Iran, secondary sanctions on companies that deal with Iran. As a result, Iran has been unable to engage with the international financial sector. All the purchases that need to go through SWIFT, for example, SWIFT code are not valid in Iran, cannot operate in Iran. European companies who might operate in Iran are concerned about secondary sanctions. That is, if they engage with Iran, the US might impose sanctions on them. So, and they might be subject to penalty. They might be subject to losing other deals with the United States. So secondary sanction has been a serious impediment to international engagement with Iran. So how is Raisi going to manage this, in a way, quagmire? Whether or not he would push for the renewal of the nuclear deal is still an open question. He has in the past emphasized the importance of resistance economy. And that's a term that is used by the conservatives and hardliners to reject Rouhani's push, Rouhani's desire to break the sanctions, to achieve sanctions relief through signing a nuclear deal. Instead, resistance economy is supposed to emphasize self-sufficiency, emphasize the ability of the Iranian economy to stand on its own feet without depending, without relying on external trade. So, given that has been the history of his political thinking and where he is coming from in terms of the conservative bedrock that he's coming from, it is difficult to see that he would push for a deal, and whether or not he would actually appreciate and sees merit in achieving sanctions relief. In many ways, Raisi sounds like Ahmadinejad, and I'm going to come back to this point because he very much sounds like a populist leader who really exaggerates the ability of the Iranian nation as he sees it, to withstand external pressure, to withstand external bullying, to stand in the face of unjust global order, and be true to its own principles. So it's a very populist message that Raisi has been delivering, and it does sound very much like Ahmadinejad. What could seriously push Iran in the direction of a nuclear deal is that the supreme leader has already given his consent and his go-ahead to the deal. Rouhani came to office with this very clear mandate to secure sanctions relief because Rouhani realized and appreciated the significance of relief, the damage that sanctions were doing to Iranian economy, and the damage that the sanctions were doing to the legitimacy of the regime as a whole. This wasn't about the reformists versus the conservative camp. This was about saving the regime as a whole because it was proving unable to deliver. It was proving unable to satisfy the needs of the population and losing credibility for that failure. So the supreme leader appreciated that point, that signing a nuclear deal, making Iranian nuclear technology subject to very extreme international monitoring and observation was a fair price to pay for the removal of sanctions and for the opening up of the Iranian economy to international markets. So, in a way, you might say it was seen as an existential threat that Rouhani has been trying to address with the consent and approval of the supreme leader. None of that has changed. Raisi coming to office doesn't change any of that. So that does provide some impetus and some force towards securing a nuclear deal. Now, a lot has been said about China. China presents an alternative model for Iran. A lot of people talked about a look east approach in Iran so that Iran would compensate all the shortcomings that sanctions have been placing on Iran by dealing with China. So you have the two foreign ministers there, Iran and Chinese foreign minister, discussing a strategic deal. China has been investing significantly in southern part of Iran, building a port that would facilitate its own connection through the Bridge and Road Initiative. to connect China with Europe and the global economy. So Iran has been looking at China seriously, has been courting China seriously as an alternative. There's another factor that should be kept in mind is that China doesn't bring a lot of demands on Iran when it comes to political demands. There's always dealing with the United States, dealing with the West, with Europe, can be seen as a package deal. That is, you're not just signing an economic treaty or trade treaty. You're signing into an American way of life. You're signing into American values, Western values. You open up the economy to European companies and American companies, and they bring with them values that would question the traditional way of doing things, the Iranian revolutionary principles. So there's always that concern that orienting oneself towards the West would subject Iran to a lot of cultural pressure, a lot of ideological pressure, while China has none of that. China doesn't impose its own values on its partners, especially Iran, or others in the Middle East, for that matter. And it does, so in that sense, it looks quite an attractive proposition for authoritarian leaders. And of course, China is an authoritarian model of development. Iran would very much like to learn from China how to excel economically, but maintain a tight control over the political system and not open up politically. So that presents an attractive option to the Iranian leadership. But I suspect the Iranian leadership is also aware that China may not be as reliable and as forthcoming towards Iran as they might expect, because China is also bound by a UN sanctions regime, not US sanctions regime, but UN sanctions regime, which does place certain limitations on how China, what China can deal with, what kind of commodities China can purchase or sell to Iran. And of course, arms is off the table. And China is also subject to secondary US sanctions. So again, if China flaunts US sanctions openly, then China would be subject to secondary sanctions. It's not to say that China has not tried, and there have been reports of barter trades where China, purchases Iran oil through barter arrangements, not direct purchase through, monetary purchases. So there have been attempts, but China has been circumspect in its dealings with Iran. And regionally speaking, China is concerned and interested in the whole of the Middle East, not just Iran. China has very important big deals with Saudi Arabia, with UAE, with Oman. So there are many other players that China is concerned with. It's not just Iran. And Iran can't expect that in a time of crisis, China would come to its aid against other regional powers, or against the US for that matter. So the question of reliability is a live one, and many in Tehran are also concerned with that. Now, just a quick note on Iran's regional context. And that is going to have a bearing on how the leadership in Iran manages its position with the United States, manages position with others in the region, and with Europe. And of course, it has implications for the nuclear deal. Regionally, you might say Iran is in a very hostile environment. a lot of it is due to Iran's its own policies, and that is, it might be a question of chicken or egg situation. Did Iran generate a hostile environment, or did the hostility in the region lead to fear and apprehension in Tehran? Nonetheless, the environment is hostile, and a lot of the policies that Iran is making is coming from that perspective, that Iran needs to secure itself within a very hostile environment. There is an arms embargo, as I mentioned, on Iran. So Iranian military cannot replenish and cannot rejuvenate and upgrade its military infrastructure. The military infrastructure in Iran is aging in comparison with what is happening in Saudi Arabia and UAE, where they are purchasing state-of-the-art weaponry. And this is clearly a cause for concern in Iran. But what the Iranians can do is to look for alternative ways of enhancing Iran's national security. And that is by investing in asymmetrical warfare. And that is by investing in its own proxies. And that's one factor that has caused so much angst and so much concern in regional capitals. And that's one factor that is not covered by the nuclear deal. And that's why a lot of the regional powers are concerned and critical of the nuclear deal. Now, these are some of the key proxies that Iran has been courting. Hezbollah is probably the most organized and most famous proxy that Iran has developed in Lebanon. Excuse me. And that has served a very important role for Iranian image in the region. Iran prides itself as standing up against Israel, prides itself against itself for standing up for Palestinian rights and Palestinian interests, and investing in Hezbollah and allowing Hezbollah to engage militarily with Israel, where many of the Arab states have failed, and now they are signing peace deals with Israel. So it has really helped in the Iranian narrative, helped its own standing as the champion of Muslim interests, Palestinian interests. And Hezbollah has been very effective in the war in Syria. So when the war broke out in Syria, and the Syrian government seemed to be unable and ill-prepared to deal with the growing intensity of anti-Assad forces, Iran called upon Hezbollah to move its forces into Syrian territory and combat some of those anti-Assad forces, which it did quite effectively. Other forces that Iran has been organizing is, you might refer to Fatemiyun and Zainabiyun, two paramilitary brigades that are made up of Afghan refugees in Iran, and some Pakistani Shia that Iran has managed to recruit and organize and send to Syria to fight against anti-Assad forces. And then there are quite a number in Iraq, many small groups, some not so small groups that have benefited from Iranian patronage, Iranian finance, and Iranian training. And you might remember that Qasem Soleimani, General Qasem Soleimani, who was representing Iran's Revolutionary Guard in the region, had very close contact with Qatar Hezbollah in Iraq, and was assassinated by the United States, along with Qatar Hezbollah's chief in Iraq. And of course, there's Yemen. The connection with Houthis in Yemen has been debated. It's not very clear how much Iran is investing in the Houthis in Yemen, but there is a connection, and clearly Iran sees advantage in spreading out its connections and networks regionally, just in case Iran needs to rely on them and call upon them to come to its aid. And distracting Saudi Arabia and Yemen, obviously serving Iranian interests. And of course, there are some other networks within Saudi Arabia, in Afghanistan. We can come back to those during Q&A, if you like. So I'm mindful of the time. As I mentioned, Raisi's vision, in fact, I'm not sure if Raisi really has a vision for Iranian foreign policy making. In many ways, he has been trying to play on these populist sentiments that people have the power and people who are in power are corrupt, namely President Rouhani, who's going to step down in a day or two. So Raisi will be president in 2 days' time in Iran. So he's been campaigning that those who hold power are corrupt, and that is why Iranian economy is in such a dire strait. It's due to their nepotism and corruption. It's not due to the sanctions and any other issue. So he has been playing on this motif. And to a large extent, I think this really speaks to Raisi's lack of experience in matters of state. He has been in the judiciary throughout his career. He was a prosecutor. He was a supreme judge, the chief justice. In contrast, you might say, Rouhani has had a lot of first-hand experience in matters of state. Rouhani was the secretary of the Supreme National Security Council, so he was very much aware of the big global issues and big global trends that affected Iran. And he was chief negotiator on the nuclear deal prior to that. So again, he has had that level of international exposure and direct dealing with counterparts internationally, which I think gave him a much better feel for real challenges rather than imagined challenges, imagined threats. So Raisi has that kind of limitation, which does limit his vision. He is very close to the Supreme Leader. He was appointed as the Chief Justice by the Supreme Leader, and between him and Supreme Leader, they appointed the Guardian Council, which then kept them in power. So he's very reliant on the Supreme Leader, which tells me that he is not going to come up with anything original, that he is going to follow the Supreme Leader quite closely in his thinking. Does that mean that Iran is going to sign the nuclear deal? Reverting it back to the nuclear deal issue, I think if the United States is prepared to return to what was on the table before the United States withdrew from the deal, it's very likely that the deal will be signed. But if the United States tries to renegotiate something different, if the United States feels pressure by its partners in the Middle East to include issues of Iran's regional approach, Iran's proxy links, Iran's ballistic program, for example. So if other items are tried to be incorporated in the deal, then that would be a very difficult deal to achieve. And that's my conclusion. I'm going to leave some time for Q&A.
Professor, thank you immensely for that. That was an incredible amount of detail to be able to put into half hour. We already have some questions in the chat that are all fantastic. I might actually start with one of the with one-liner here. Has Raisi's policies changed much over the last 5 years, or have they stayed fairly consistent?
Well, Raisi has been a conservative. Um, he has dealt with the judiciary, and he has remained very consistent in that space. Um, he hasn't had to deal with international affairs. Um, the only obvious international issue that he has dealt with was the nuclear deal, where he was very critical. And you might say that he has changed his perspective and he has changed his view. Rather than being critical now, he is saying he will abide by the deal if one is signed. So it does show some level of flexibility on his part. But I think that also shows a level of awareness that he doesn't want to stand up to the supreme leader. If the supreme leader has okayed the deal, then it's good enough for him.
And just to follow up there, you've spoken about the new leadership being in place, but there seems to be a sense that the new leadership is a lot more deferential to the supreme leader than Rouhani has been on certain things in the past. Is that a fair assessment?
That is a very fair assessment. The new leadership, if we don't know who is going to occupy the various ministries, so that's to be debated yet. But from what we have seen and from Raisi's own political background, it's very likely that we are going to have a very complicit government that very closely follows the supreme leader's command.
Mm. And then from that, what does it look like for a succession plan in that side of the leadership then? There's a question in the chat about the supreme leader's health, but perhaps more broadly than that, what does that leadership chain look like?
Sure. Raisi has been noted as a potential successor to Khamenei as the next supreme leader. In fact, he ticks a lot of the boxes in that space because he's a conservative. He has had the confidence of the supreme leader. He is someone who's not going to rock the boat. He is not going to come up with anything new. We should not expect any new innovation with Raisi in office. You know, with Khatami, we had the Dialogue of Civilization campaign. He really pushed that idea of civilizations need to have a dialogue. He was trying to overcome the animosity, the tension, and he was supposed to act as a circuit breaker in Iran's foreign affairs. Rouhani came to office. Rouhani has been quite modest in comparison with Khatami. He hasn't had that big, grand vision, but he had a very practical vision of let's get this nuclear deal done because this is going to open up opportunities and bring Iran out of isolation, and that's going to open up more doors and more opportunities. So again, there has been some kind of a limited vision. Raisi hasn't had any vision. He hasn't proposed anything new. All he has said is that he would deal with corruption and nepotism in the economy, and again invest in Iran's resistance economy, which is just rehashing very old and tried rhetoric.
And I think that comes on very nicely to the next question here in the chat. Please do keep them coming, by the way. Do ask as many questions as you can. That it seems like there's an undercurrent of there not really being any quote unquote new leadership per se, but that there seems to be quite tight continuations within Iranian leadership at both supreme leader and presidential level. So what do you think that Khamenei is ready for a new deal with the new US administration?
I think yes, I think the observation about continuity is very apt. Absolutely. There's a very pronounced continuity of leadership. I think the supreme leader has has seen the benefits. It's a pro and con situation. There are merits in signing the deal for Iran, and there are prices that Iran has to pay for the deal. The nuclear deal is quite unusual in the sense that it is putting Iran under quite extreme international observation and monitoring. This is way above any other inspection regime that the international community has imposed on any country. So it's a big ask. But the supreme leader has seen the benefit of agreeing to this extreme deal because it does bring Iran out of isolation. As I mentioned, in many ways, this was an existential question for the regime as a whole. It wasn't about the conservative camp or the reformist camp. It was about the regime as a whole and its ability to maintain power, its ability to provide services to the population, but also its ability to provide patronage to its own supporters within the state, within Iran. And that ability was weakening. So sanctions relief was supposed to help Iran address that shortcoming. So yes, I think the supreme leader sees merit in signing the deal so long as it is that exact deal, but not a variation of the deal that has other additional components to it. Like, as I mentioned, the ballistic facility that Iran has been pursuing, or Iran's patronage and support for proxy actors throughout the region, which is a big factor for Saudi Arabia, for UAE. They have been criticizing Iran for an expansionist foreign policy. And they point to various Shia militias in the region, in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, and saying this is an example of Iran's tentacles spreading across the region and evidence of Iran's expansionism. So if Biden, and of course Israel has been very much pushing that agenda too. So if Biden accepts that message and tries to bring those points into the nuclear deal, then it becomes a very different proposition for Iran, and I don't think they're going to accept that.
And do you think there's a chance that there will be those additional things brought into the negotiations? Do you think Biden will take this opportunity to somewhat assuage those fears from Iran, from Saudi Arabia, and from Israel?
I think there's a possibility that there will be elements of those concerns seeping into the conversation. Biden has been quite practical, and he has appointed a number of seasoned diplomats to engage in negotiations with Iran, people who know Iran and people who know the region. So they are not ideologically colored as Trump's administration was in the way they were dealing with Iran. Nonetheless, there are pressures coming from Israel, as a very important U.S. ally, Saudi Arabia. So I would not be surprised if there are elements of those concerns coming into the conversation and making it difficult for Iran to accept the deal.
And I might jump in here and ask a question of my own, just very briefly. In the recent past, I've seen a fair bit of analysis that has highlighted Iran's potential patronage of Lebanon in certain ways. And does the increase in tension that Israel's experiencing in the region in any way affect their input on the US's involvement in the nuclear deal?
I think I lost the question. Sorry, James.
No, that's quite all right. No, I probably didn't ask that. Does the uptick in Israel's current tensions in the region affect the US's going into these negotiations, do you think?
I think Israel is always a big factor. I think Israel has been pushing for a resolute response to Iran's nuclear program. Israel has been actually suggesting that they can go off and bomb Iranian nuclear facilities without UN consent or UN involvement. So there are suggestions to that effect. That is going to be taken seriously in Washington, and that is going to play on the minds of U.S. Policymakers and negotiators. To what extent that is articulated in actual talks, no one knows. These talks are held behind closed doors. There are no reports coming out. They are held in Vienna behind closed doors. Delegates go in and they're not allowed to report to the media. So we don't really know what is said. We just get a feel that it is dragging on, and it's been dragging on for months. Rouhani was keen to sign the deal before he left office. And I think the Biden administration felt the same way, that they wanted to sign the deal before Rouhani left office, but they haven't yet. And that tells me that there are a lot of other factors that are being discussed, which are not easy to resolve.
Going from that very high politics now to a question on how has the sanctions actually affected the Iranian people? How has the economic blockade affected the Iranian people?
Well, hugely. The people have to take two jobs. There is inflation, there is high unemployment, and the figures are just astronomical. Sometimes it's hard to believe the figures because they look so unreal. Anecdotally, from people I talk to in Iran, they always manage to get by, and it's amazing how resilient the Iranian population is. They always manage to get by. They always find some alternative ways of surviving, of buying the commodities. But it does mean cuts here and there. It does mean being careful here and there. And of course, the lower classes are suffering the most. The middle class might be managing, but the lower class are suffering the most. And it is, in a way, ironic that the whole Iranian revolution was about representing the lower classes and the have-nots. And it's the have-nots who are really bearing the brunt of sanctions and bearing the brunt of the Iranian, the collapse of the economy, really. Well, and just I want to add to that, there have been reports in the media about water shortage in south of Iran, where the Arab population resides, the Khuzestan. And I just thought that there's something about minorities in Iran, so I might go there, but I can come back to the Kurdish issue later. The Khuzestan is oil rich. It has been the engine of Iranian economy for decades, even prior to revolution. At the same time, Khuzestan is one of the poorest regions in Iran, extremely underdeveloped, and extremely impoverished. And they have been suffering water shortage, and now that they are protesting water shortage in the street, they are met with guns in the street. So there have been casualties, there have been deaths. So there is growing tension in Iran, especially among the have-nots and the underprivileged, who don't have the ability to make alternative plans.
Well, I think to that, actually, let's stay here, because I think it's a very interesting point that you raise here. Is that it seems that it's mostly affected low socioeconomic status people in Iran. Has it also kind of intersected with affecting Kurds more as well?
Well, Kurds are in a very special situation in Iran, I guess. Kurds are, as you will know, as everyone here will know, Kurds are spread across five nations, 5 states, and what happened in Iraq and then in Syria has really encouraged Kurdish nationalism and has encouraged the Kurdish sense of future, that there is future for the Kurdish state. Kurds have been a close ally of the United States, both in Iraq and in Syria. And, you know, fighting against Saddam, or fighting against ISIS, fighting against Bashar al-Assad. So all of that makes a very complex and confusing picture, because Kurds in Iran are not friendly with the United States so much, but they do have a sense of affinity and connection with Kurds in Iraq and Syria. And Kurdish gains in Iraq and Syria has given hope to Kurds in Iran that there is future for them. And that is a major, major concern for the authorities in Tehran, who don't want to see Iran split into separate smaller states. Iran has many minority communities. It has Kurds, Baluch, Arabs, Turkmens, Azeris. So Iran has been concerned about Kurdish separatism from the very beginning, and that concern has continued, which does mean that Iran has responded through the only way it knows, and that is through security crackdown on potential separatists.
And will that affect Iran's relations with the West, do you think?
Not directly. I don't think that's going to feature prominently in negotiations with in international negotiations. But if what human rights violations capture international media headlines again, that could become an issue. And that is why I mentioned it's not going to be an issue with China. China doesn't care less if Iran shoots its own citizens.
Yeah.
In fact, China is engaged in doing that itself. And Iran has looked the other way in relation to how China is treating its Uyghur population. So China and Iran have something in common in the way they treat their own minorities.
Well, to that point, actually, was the nuclear deal then Rouhani's only option for normalization with the West, or was it just the most expedient? Was it just the best way to ensure the continuation of legitimacy for the regime in the short term?
It was Iran's and Rouhani's best option to address the economic slowdown and the economic decline in Iran, and the ability of the regime to hold on to power. That was the best way. Iran did experiment with the look east option, dealing with China, but as I mentioned, there are only so much you can benefit from dealing with China. Iran did talk about an experiment with engaging with its regional neighbors, but normalization of relations with Saudi Arabia, with UAE, have all been contingent on a significant change in Iranian foreign policy, especially its national defense doctrine of forward defense, that is, its investment in proxies in other countries. So that has been a stumbling block in improving ties with regional powers.
And to that point, actually, you've just spoken there about the significant economic issues that the Iranian government face. Can we expect any overarching policies or a major economic set of reforms from this next new leadership?
No, I don't expect any significant reforms. As I mentioned, Raisi really didn't have a vision. He was only coming to the electoral campaign with a message that the government is corrupt, is inefficient, I can do better. There was no new vision, there was no new proposition that Rouhani brought to the electorate. And in many ways, his slogans and his rhetoric harks back to going back to the essence of the Iranian revolution: resistance economy, self-reliant, standing up for what is right for Iran against American bullying. So there is nothing new in Raisi's mandate.
And you've spoken there just very briefly on the regional powers that are affecting Iran, and that Iran affects as well, fundamentally. Do you see there's any chance for normalization amongst the regional powers, maybe specifically with Saudi Arabia?
Well, you would hope so. I would hope so, because instability and tension in the region is bad for everyone. And this sense of mutual distrust that they have against each other is really undermining confidence, undermining stability in the region. It's leading and feeding an arms race in the region. It's just bad. So you would hope that they find a way to bury their hatchets and find some kind of accommodation. I haven't seen anything in the Iranian leadership or the Saudi leadership to suggest that we have reached that point. And that's the unfortunate part of it. The Saudi leadership is now becoming a lot more assertive, a lot more sure of itself. Saudi leadership used to try to deal behind the scene, quiet diplomacy, not so much in your face. Well, Saudi Arabia has been involved in a foreign intervention in Yemen, trying to deal with a potential threat. This would have been unheard of in the past. 10 years ago, Saudi Arabia would not be doing this, sending troops to a neighboring country. Same thing when they sent troops to Bahrain to deal with the popular revolt against the regime there during the Arab Spring. So there is nothing in Saudi Arabian leadership that would suggest that they are open to accommodation, and I can't see anything that Raisi is bringing to the table. As I mentioned, he really doesn't have a lot of vision in the way he's conducting himself.
Is there a sense that Raisi could grow into the role? Is there anything to suggest that he could grow into the role?
Well, yeah, there's every possibility that he might grow into the role. In fact, if you have followed Iranian politics, Ahmadinejad, when he came to office, he was very much beholden to the supreme leader, and he was very much in the pocket of the Revolutionary Guards. And he had his support base in the Revolutionary Guards. But in his second term in office, Ahmadinejad became quite a prickly figure for the supreme leader, challenging the supreme leader, challenging even the Revolutionary Guards for their own business, trying to come up with his own vision that was very different. He was playing a very populist game, especially in his second term, trying to say, I'm not part of the establishment, I'm not part of the regime, I'm someone new, someone that represents the people. So he went through that transformation himself. It didn't do much good for him or for Iran, but it does suggest that Raisi could possibly go through transformation, hopefully for the better.
I might connect a couple of the last questions that we've got just into kind of a single one, because there's a couple of threads that are running through our questions now. Has Iran in the past 18 months, it's been affected very badly by COVID. We've all seen that in the news, how awful the situation has been at times in Iran. Is there a sense that Iran has had the same sort of security issues as a lot of other states during COVID? Is there a sense that it's pushing people more towards hardline factions or in different political directions than they would have before COVID?
Well, the COVID pandemic in Iran did a lot of damage. Obviously, the health system was quite unprepared to deal with infection. And in the beginning, they didn't take it seriously. In the beginning, there was a parliamentary election, I believe, and the supreme leader was saying, don't worry about this infection. It's like a cold. You might catch a common cold. It's not going to stop you from going to work or going to the ballot polls, polling stations. So they put their head in the sand, and that made Iran a hotspot for the whole region. So a lot of infection spread actually from Iran to the region, which gave Iran really bad press. It also undermined Rouhani's ability to, this was another failure for the Rouhani administration. Rouhani had failed the nuclear deal, and now he had failed to provide health system to the population. And infections continue to spread in Iran. It's quite widely spread in Iran. It's a major health issue. So the reformist camp really lost confidence in Rouhani and his administration. And in fact, lost confidence in their own ability to mount a serious challenge into the leadership in Iran. We have to remember that Rouhani wasn't a reformist himself. Rouhani was very much a pragmatist who saw the challenges, who saw the problems because of his position, and acknowledged that there needs to be a way of addressing these challenges. He didn't promise political openness. He promised economic openness. The reformist camp said, okay, well, if this is the best we can get, let's support Rouhani. And they threw their support behind him, and it did not achieve the expected results. So Rouhani has failed on a number of accounts, number of fronts, and that has really undermined and, in a way, disillusioned the reformist camp. And that is why, at the last election, participation rate was below 50%, and that's because the reformist camp just did not bother showing up to the ballot boxes.
Well, I've got time for one last question. I might draw together some of the many elements that you've been able to take us through tonight, and ask, given that we're now entering a space of new Iranian leadership, how will Rouhani's legacy be remembered, do you think?
As a failure. As an abysmal failure, because as I mentioned, he came to office with a very single mandate of reviving the economy by signing a nuclear deal. It wasn't his fault that President Trump withdrew from the nuclear deal. That was out of his control, but it was a complete failure. And the fact that Iran is even more isolated in the region than the time Rouhani came into office hasn't done anything to give him to revive his legacy.
Well, on that final point, the final point of Iran on the crest of a new political era, perhaps, or perhaps maybe a continuation of a previous one, we might leave it there. So, Professor Akbarzadeh, thank you so very much for tonight. The talk was wide-ranging, informative, interesting. Drew together so many different elements of what's going on in Iran right now. I want to apologize to all of those whose questions I didn't get to in the chat. We just had quite a lot of interest tonight, as you can imagine, in such a fascinating event. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for attending tonight. Professor, thank you again, and we'll see you soon.
I'd like to thank you, James, for sharing, and the Institute for inviting me. It's been lovely to chat with you.
Thank you.
Thanks.